Hello. So, once again, we find ourselves at one of these presentations where the slides are going to be useful. I'm going to be referencing them, but really they're not much compared to the script. They are there to But I'm also going to start off by asking you a very special favor. Please listen to the whole thing before commenting, because I'm going to go into a lot of specifics. And I'm going to try and give you a different take on Pearl Harbor than you're probably going to see elsewhere today. Because there are going to be probably a lot of videos produced about the attack on Pearl Harbor. I can think of a few people who I know who are going to produce excellent videos. If you haven't seen the video which Naval put out last year, the series on the salvage of Operation Pearl Harbor, and how successful and how quickly that swung into work and what that produced for the US war effort, I highly recommend you go and watch it. This is going to be different. This is going to be about the strategy behind Pearl Harbor. Because, honestly, there are two words I absolutely hate to hear whenever someone mentions Pearl Harbor. And that is Kantai Kessen. Because I know that means that person probably only knows of one Japanese naval doctrine. I've done a video myself about the Kantai Kessen. I've talked about the Philippine Sea and whether it was a decisive battle in terms of the Kantai Kessen. And I've talked about the effect of the Kantai Kessen Doctrine on cruisers. And there certainly is a big impact on cruisers, and I would argue to an extent on the development of naval aviation in the Japanese force from this particular pillar of their doctrine. But it is by no means the totality of their doctrine. It is by no means the sum of the whole. In fact, we are talking about one of the most active and thoughtful, tactical, strategic, and doctrinal development places in the world in terms of Imperial Japan. Mainly because there was a constant competition. The Imperial Japanese Army would put forward one competing philosophical view of the world, usually centered around ruling Asia, and somehow being able to magically control this empire without needing to control the sea. Because they forgot the point that where Japan, their industrial and financial and human resource hub, is an island. And the primary communication of that with the land is by ship. The Imperial Japanese Army doesn't do joined-up thinking. The Imperial Japanese Army does its own internal factions. This is another joy you have to remember with all of the discussions we're going to be talking about. You don't just have the IGA versus the IJN. You have factions within the IGN versus factions within the IJN versus factions within the IJA versus factions within the IJA versus anything else. And sometimes those factions will form some really, well, there's another way to describe it, unholy alliances. They're alliances which you cannot see how they work from a strategic and theoretical perspective. From what they are advocating, they must surely completely coherently disagree In fact, if any group you would expect to be more likely to be engaging in internecine warfare and assassination, it would be these groups, and yet they are allied. Because it's convenient. Because for that moment they decide that something else is a greater threat. So this is what this video is about. It's about the other doctrines. It's about where the attack on Pearl Harbor fits in Japanese doctrine. Arguably why it is not a bolt out of the blue, even if you don't have intelligence, which may or may not suggest it's coming. The fact is, Japan's been thinking about this sort of thing for a long time. So what's the overview of this going to be? Well, I'm going to first look at the Kantai Kessen Doctrine itself and talk about it. Because there are some misunderstandings about the decisive battle. For starters, there are some people who put it down literally as a pure cribbing of Mahan, and as well, anyone who's actually read Mahan will tell you Mahan is not quite so monofocused or monotheistic in terms of the decisive battle. He does talk about the virtue of decisive battles. They're useful. It's always nice to have a decisive battle. But in reality, in naval warfare, there are very few decisive battles in history. And when you study the period of naval warfare he talks about, in his seminal work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1616 to 1783, definitely what brings up most of it, and what starts it out in terms of his output. There is a lot of battles in there which are neither decisive in terms of who actually wins them, or in terms of outcome, or legacy, or actual results. They're just battles. He is making the case for a battle fleet. He is talking about battle to try and get the battlefield constructed for the US Navy. And again, you have to remember it's not too dissimilar to a scenario to what the IJN is facing. Emphasizing the Kantai Kessen Doctrine is sensible when you're trying to make the case for a fleet, for a battle fleet, a capable fleet, especially in a time when you need one. Because this is the guy who, combined with Theodore Roosevelt, managed to make the case that actually got Congress to open their purse strings. If you're in a death or glory match with the Imperial Japanese Army for funding, wouldn't you want to study his work? But that doesn't mean, by any stretch of the imagination, that the Japanese limited themselves to Mahan. They didn't limit themselves to anyone, and they certainly didn't take a simplistic reading of Mahan. That certainly wasn't the basis for their entire strategy and entire war doctrine. I will regularly ridicule the Kantai Kessen Doctrine because there are major problems with it. But that's because it's a great selling doctrine for selling your navy and for getting it built. It's not necessarily a great doctrine on its own for an actual operational philosophy. This is why we're going into the next section, which is, was it the only doctrine that was applicable to Japan? Then, how does the attack on Pearl Harbor potentially fit into the doctrine? Potentially not fit in the doctrine. Where does it fit? As planned, how does it fit? As executed, how does it fit? Comparison with the Royal Navy's attack on Taranto. A summary. And for a bonus, the discussion of the Yamato class. Basically, my idea was you might enjoy it. To see where they fit, to see why Japan is building super battleships when pretty much every book you read, and I would argue this one especially, will put very strongly the thesis that the super battleships were the worst thing the Japanese Navy could build because they destroyed their industrial capacity to build anything else. And you don't have to disagree with them on that one. But you also have to think about why they were built versus how they were used. There is a difference. So, Japanese strategy. Honestly, when you boil down to it, the decisive battle doctrine is an idea which fits a form of history where you have a culture and a national identity based around we have a fight and then we have a negotiation. And the side which has won the fight gets to dictate most of the peace. Now, there is a small problem with this. As the Greeks found when they were fighting the Romans, as pretty much anyone in history has found when fighting the British or the Americans. To an extent, the Italians. And I would argue the Chinese as well. To an extent. Depends on the era and who they're fighting. Let's be honest, when you're fighting the Mongol hordes, you can sort of understand a little bit of negotiation going on. The point is, you either have it as a national mindset, as a perfectly reasonable policy, or you don't. You also have to put it in the context of what they're presuming. This is a military government. You'll receive many quotes if you go and look through what the Americans and the British and even the Japanese themselves were saying about their government in the 1920s and 1930s. They are viewed as increasingly militaristic, increasingly driven by the military. And if you come from an ordered background where there's a hierarchy which is enforced, theoretically based on ability and experience, theoretically, you can look at a democracy, the political fights that take place, as being messy, destructive, weakening. You can look at them and presume that you are facing something different than you are. You can decide, well, the public will never vote for that, so they'll never fight a war. They won't fight a long war. They'll want peace. After they're all destroyed, they'll want peace. It's a nice idea. But it forgets something about these countries. Some of them, honestly, don't understand that. It's not their way. They don't understand the idea of we've lost, so now we give in and we have a treaty. Some have had to learn that lesson, but some others have, through fortune, stubbornness, who knows what, haven't. Not at this point. They might have learned it later, but they haven't at this point. You also have another problem. A decisive battle is a lovely thing to aim for, but even during World War II, you have 4 different commander-in-chiefs of the combined fleet. So I would argue 4 different operational heads of the Navy. You have, as I've done in previous videos, talked about the chiefs of the Imperial Naval Staff, and you have the Navy Minister. Who usually answers to the Chief of the Imperial Naval Staff. And the combined fleet, who theoretically answers to the Chief of the Imperial Naval Staff, but in de facto becomes a sort of second power position in the fleet. The sort of pretender. And the Minister for the Navy gets caught in between the two. It's quite funny to watch at certain points in history. If it wasn't for thinking about the amount of people whose lives are going to be risked on basically what is a political power play that's deciding the fate of ships and construction. Doctrine, strategy, tactics. These things are never so much set in stone as guidelines. They are ideas to think of, ideas to start from and bounce. But different leaders, different minds will come up with different variations on them. And sometimes they'll fuse multiple doctrines together, multiple ideas together. Specifics of the Kantai Kessen in its implementation. They should expect to achieve a local superiority of force that allows you to overwhelm your enemy to deliver a devastating blow unto them. This will normally be achieved by a concentration of your total fleet versus a smaller portion of the enemy fleet. But preferably a large enough formation of the enemy fleet that its loss will significantly and adversely affect their ability to outmass or concentrate against you. As I said, it's rooted to an extent in one concentrated interpretation of Mahan, but it's got much more to it than that. In fact, the entire Japanese strategical thinking has got much more to it than that. So, key points to look for in the Kantai Kessen. If we are looking at Pearl Harbor and thinking about it, Kantai Kessen, if it's Kantai Kessen operation, we'd have to consider this later. Is it against a significant portion of the enemy fleet? Is it a majority portion or even whole Japanese fleet operation? Because of the latter requirement, it will tend to be conceived as taking place closer to Japan, as the risk of a long-range deployment would mean that Japan might itself be left uncovered. Adaptable. Again, you have to remember the Kantai Kessen is put together as an idea for many different operations. You could be fighting the Russians, you could be fighting the Chinese, you could be fighting the Dutch, or the Americans. The Japanese strategy is not single nation focused. Yes, one of the important and most interesting fights within the IJN relationship was who to set as their theoretical benchmark enemy that they were supposed to prepare for war against. This is an interesting and almost theological debate that takes place in Japan and is not over nearly as quickly or as simply or as straightforwardly as you would expect, because at various times the army wants to set a standard one. And the one they almost always want to focus on is, well, especially in the interwar period, is the Soviet Union of Socialist Republics, or rather the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Because that would require a large army, but not require a navy, because, frankly, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has pretty much zilch. Thanks to a combination of revolutions and communism, the First World War, and the Russo-Japanese War. Now, this particular opponent would therefore benefit the army by allowing them to get the vast majority of the funding. Can't think why the IJN didn't want to do that. They wanted to focus on America. Now, again, why do they want to do that? Well, is it because they don't like America? Well, there have been issues of, let's put it this way, some of the anti-Japanese policies and articles and things that have gone on the west coast of America during the sort of the more recent period, let's say, due to Japanese immigration and some of the stuff which is basically being targeted at them, has come home and has upset a significant amount of the populace. It's become a political issue which some, let's say, more firebrandish politicians like to use. But again, more about that funding battle, because have a look at this lovely map. Basically, any war versus America is going to be 90% naval. So who should 90% of the funding go to? And the Kantai Kessen is a great doctrine for that, because if you're preparing for a decisive battle versus an opponent who is going to outnumber you and outmass you because of the treaty system. Oh. Just justifies you paying for so many toys. It's legitimate, because, this is a legitimate strategic threat, but it's useful. They're not the only doctrine available. There is also Taikan Kisho Shugi, which is big ships, big guns. Now, before you think, Alex, you have taken leave of your senses. This is not a war-fighting strategy. It isn't. It's a deterrent strategy. Because this is not focused on military service personnel. It's not focused on naval officers. It is a strategy which is focused on politicians and civilians of enemy nations. I.e., we have a colossal battleship. Yes, you have more, but look at how big and powerful our battleship is. Can you match it? It's a deterrent strategy. It's kind of an inverse of the risk fleet idea. The risk fleet doctrine, as Tirpitz had implemented it, was to build up a significant number of ships. In contrast, if we take the Taikan Kicho Shugi approach, what he would have instead been concentrating on would be building less ships but more powerful vessels, i.e. would have immediately jumped for bigger guns than the Royal Navy. Would have immediately jumped for bigger ship, faster ship, more guns, more armor, and just kept building them a couple at a time. So nowhere near. So the Royal Navy sitting there going, yeah, you have two of those. Yes, they are about 20% better than the ones we're building. That's not really not going to bother us that much, because we have 6. which we're building to your 2. And so you have a 240% fleet. We have a 600% fleet. That's a 5-2 advantage. But it's going to affect the politicians. The politicians are going to be worried about it. The politicians are going to be looking at the Royal Navy and going, are your ships big enough? Royal Navy probably going, we'd never say no to bigger guns. But this is the idea behind the Japanese construction policy. It's to make the public and to make the politicians think that the ships they have aren't enough. To make them think that we can't go to war yet because we can't match this. It is a doctrine of deterrence. It is a doctrine of psychological warfare. It is also a doctrine which makes a realization on the limitations of your own industry. I.e., can you afford to build and crew more ships? If not, then you have to come up with a way of making the ships you have count. Taikan Kyosho Shugi. Next one. Yugeki Zengen Zakusen. Now, this basically translates as interception attrition operations. But it's best defined as everything that takes place that makes actually Kantai Kessen a viable doctrine, and actually the Kantai Kessen is just a small component of. In that, if we look at first wave, at the start of hostilities, the Navy would destroy the US Asiatic fleet and, in cooperation with the Army, seize Luzon in the Philippines and Guam. These actions would eliminate American strongholds in the Western Pacific. And that seems rather coherent, and where have I heard about that happening before? Remember, this is mostly this strategy comes up long before the American fleet moves to Pearl Harbor, or even before they really get anything on the West Coast working viably. Second, submarines would proceed to the Eastern Pacific, where they would monitor the movement of the main American fleet. They would track the American force as it set out westward and attack it repeatedly to diminish its strength. Third, naval aircraft based in the South Seas mandated islands, hereafter Micronesia, would attack the enemy once he came within range. Carry-borne aircraft would further reduce his strength. Fourth, an advanced body of cruisers and destroyers supported by fast battleships would deal a major blow to the American fleet in a night attack. This would occur once the enemy had reached the seas designed for the decisive battle and would constitute the first phase of this battle. The second and final phase would follow at daybreak, when the full weight of the main battle fleet would be thrown against the American fleet and annihilated. Cruisers, especially the heavy cruisers, because they are in this sort of phase pre to decisive battle, this actually starts to make sense of their approach of paper thin armor. Because the idea is that they go in at night and they cause as much damage as possible. Everything is on the offensive value, because in a night fight, if the enemy hits you, it's going to probably be at close range, so any armor wouldn't really help. In fact, actually having less armor means the shell might go straight through you. You can always hope. It's unlikely, but you can always hope. So, it's possible. And by the way, that comes from Yoshi Hirama's Japanese Naval Preparations for World War II, Naval War College Review, published in spring 1991, volume 44, number 2, and page 64. Yes, where I can, I have put in citations and references so you can go and find the fuller article. Now, the fuller article won't necessarily agree with me because I've used most of these for source-based things. But also, I would argue that this is something that has been coming on for a while in terms of thinking actually the Kantai Kessen might not be as important as it possibly is often portrayed as being. But you have to remember the Kantai Kessen is still what sells books. In the 1920s and 30s, it sold battleships and allowed you to build ships. In the 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, it sells books. It's a very cost-effective strategy. Yogeki Sakusan. Ambush strategy. Battle of Tsushima, where this poor vessel was sunk, because this, of course, is Radetzky's flagship, is an ambush. The idea of a surprise attack is the whole way through Japanese doctrine. I mean, I'll talk about it later, but they literally attack Port Arthur 3 hours before they declare war. Pearl Harbor is slightly better than that. Slightly. But again, if you go through Japanese history, surprise attacks are something which are a common feature of their warfare. The element of surprise is considered a crucial and vital aspect of warfighting. It's considered an automatic leveler. Something which enables a smaller force to punch above its weight and achieve a decisive outcome. They're not the only navy to practice. This is not unique to Japan. This is not unique to any navy. But the point is, they have a significant track record of doing this. Again, if you are preparing for war with the Japanese, or you think they're a high risk, surely you studied their history enough to notice, or you've at least got some academics or someone somewhere who can tell you their history and can inform you of their likelihood. If I use another thing, which I can get away with on YouTube and probably could get away in a lecture, but couldn't really get away in a book using as a description, let's consider Grand Admiral Thrawn. Okay, he's a Star Wars character. His famous sort of gimmick in Star Wars is that he can study the paintings, the literature, the music of a civilization and work out how they think, and use that to do his own planning and strategy and work out several moves in advance what they are likely to do and how they're likely to respond. I always consider that a rather complicated approach. Works for Thrawn, but it's a complicated approach. Because people have just been picking up and reading history books for years, and that's worked out fine for them. Lots of people manage that with a history book. Some decent history book, let's say. A well thought through and well researched history book. Do you want to give me if you want me to give you an actual example of such a book which was used in such a way? I can think of none better than this, which was, well, published in 2009, but there have been other books published before, but this one has been used by diplomats and people looking into the region. And I'm talking about this book called Imagining the Balkans by Maria Torova. And it's a wonderful book. This is the updated edition. And it was something which I have myself read because I was writing a paper on the Balkan region and thinking about it. Well, here you go. There is a book written by an academic which goes to, and this book is beautiful because it goes into not just the geography, but also the myths, the legends, the culture, the religion. It's really worth a read if you're interested in the Balkan region. Does it allow me to invade the Balkans? Probably I need to do some more research. But it gives me a far better understanding of them. And it's quite helpful when I'm talking to friends from that region because some of their cultural references, which are not pop culture references, I actually, to an extent, have an idea about. So it facilitates better conversation. But the point is, there are books available. There is information available. And there are so many books written about Japan and its military history after the Russo-Japanese War. I mean, there is Julian Courbet's work, for starters. We're talking about the person who wrote Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. There are others too. The thing is, this is readily available information, which should have been read by naval officers and should have been read by intelligence officers and should have been read by politicians and ambassadors to inform their discussions. Because that's the thing about this. This does not provide, these sort of information don't provide you with the ready-made answers. They don't provide you with this is what Japan will do, or this is what their strategy they're likely to hold. But it does provide you with an understanding of what they might do, of what their past actions have been like, and can give you an idea of what their cultural biases, what their instinctive touchstones might be that might guide their strategic thinking. And here is the thing you also have to put through. There is actually a whole other fight going on with Japan, because there is the Tyokokubo Hoshinin, or the Imperial Defense Policy, which is occasionally in conflict with the Tyokoku Yohei Koryu Imperial Defense Doctrine, which supposedly comes from the former, but occasionally they seem to disagree. I've got a nice little picture of the Japanese attack on Port Arthur, which took place 3 hours before the declaration of war was issued by the Japanese government, Japanese embassy to the Russian government. Anyway, the doctrine is first published in 1907. It's revised in 1918, 1923, and 1936. There are copies of it wandering around. One of the critical phrases, which in various forms starts off in 1907, but in various forms continues around for this whole period, is the Navy shall conduct operations aimed at annihilating the seaborne force of the enemy insofar as possible by forestalling him and the army at gaining the advantage of holding the initiative by rapidly concentrating the required forces in an area before the enemy can do so. Sounds a very diplomatic way of saying surprise attacks are encouraged. This is what they'd done in 3 years earlier in 1904. This is a doctrine which the British had, which they've all got. There are copies around. So, the doctrine of surprise, of concentration of force, of trying to take out a large segment of the enemy fleet as possible, the enemy forces as possible, in early stages of war, are a cornerstone of Japanese operational doctrine. Not just in the Kantai Kessen Doctrine, not just in the Yogeki Sakusen or the Yogeki Zengen Sakusen, or, well, not that one, but, Kantai Kessen. It's throughout their doctrine. In all the ones which I have not put in, mainly because I have enough trouble pronouncing the ones I have put in, and they're the major ones. Please go read this book. Most of the pronunciations I've got, I have to admit, I have had help from Google with, in terms of getting the pronunciation as close as I can. So what am I saying? Kantai Kessen's an important column doctrine in the Japanese operational doctrine. It's not the foundational doctrine. In many ways, I would argue the foundational doctrine of the Japanese forces is Yugeki Zengen Sakusen. But it's definitely one of the principal columns which holds up the overall doctrinal works. It holds up the Yohei Koryo. And it's definitely a key feature of the annual operational plans. And this is something else. We talk about War Plan Orange. We talk about the various plans which the British may or may not have. But it's often missed that the Japanese go through an annual, almost, planning process. Pretty much annual one. Called the Nendo Sankusen Kaikaho, which is an annual planning fest. So they are just obsessed with wargaming and planning as the Americans are. It's even a major feature in the justifications written into the Kokubo Shoyo Hairako, aka the military strength requirements for national defense. Again, as pointed out earlier, there is a long-running battle going on between the Imperial Japanese Navy and the Imperial Japanese Army for funding. Again, thanks to Tsushima, it's one of the best they have. One of the best cases they can make. However, that means we have to consider its prevalence and even supposed reference as being, at least in part, a political construct. Because at a certain point, you have to stop treating the IJA and the IJN as purely military or naval organizations. In fact, is any armed force a purely military organization? And also give them political weight and bearing. And then when you remember they have their internal factions as well, they become rather like the umbrella parties that we see being the major parties in most modern democracies. And when we say an umbrella party, it means it has usually some sort of common ideological basis, but lots of divisions within that, lots of sort of little groups within that big party. Democrats and Republicans in the US are the most famous umbrella parties, but you could also argue in the UK that Labour and the Conservative Party are to an extent also umbrella organisations, in that there are people in the Labour Party who are probably more likely to vote with the Conservatives than they are with Labour if you consider some of their ideological statements and some of their arguments, but they tend to vote with Labour. And the same with Conservatives voting with Labour if you consider some of their ideology and positions. So whilst I would certainly argue that the cruiser boss fleet, especially the heavy cruisers, as mentioned earlier, are structured around the Kantai Kessen Doctrine. That's what makes sense of them. And in many ways, I would argue are ruined by it. I'm sorry they are. I will refer you to my Kantai Kessen Doctrine and the Japanese cruisers video, where I argue, and I would say I make the case as well as I can on a video, that the cruisers are ruined because they don't cheat enough. They cheat enough to make them unbalanced. If they'd been prepared to cheat a little bit more, they could have achieved what they wanted and a balanced ship. And if you're already cheating, why go half measure? Do half measures? I don't understand. But that is, to an extent, part of the Japanese problem. They both want to prepare for war and avoid war because they know the reality of what they're facing. They're not as economically illiterate and industrially illiterate as so often the case is made by various people. Their decisions can be argued as being that way. Certainly, again, I have argued in the past their decisions are, but they have a logic to them. It's not a logic which makes sense when you look at it in the long term, or even the medium term. The point is, whilst the Kantai Kessen is certainly what cruisers are structured around, and arguably other portions of the Imperial Japanese Navy are structured around, it's by no means the only philosophy of war they practiced, let alone believed in, and certainly not the only one that guided them. So let's consider Pearl Harbor. The location of the US fleet in Hawaiian waters would act as a deterrent to the Japanese only so long as its positioning did not appear to the Japanese as solely a bluff. Here is the timeline for Pearl Harbor. This is why the IJN really don't have a good plan for it, because it comes into existence in September 1938 as a detachment. And when I say a detachment, it's formed around 2 heavy cruiser divisions, 2 destroyer squadrons, a single aircraft carrier, and their supporting ships and personnel. That is what the harbour is. If you look at some of the pictures from 1940, you have barely anything built. And that's a little over 18 months to 2 years later. Even by 1941, what is there is certainly not what needs to be there. In May 1940, Admiral Richardson was ordered to release a press release stating he requested permission to remain in Hawaiian waters to accomplish some things I wanted to do while here. He was told to stay there for 2 weeks. This is in May 1940. He'd made no such request, as both ammunition and targets were in short supply in Hawaii, so there was precious little he could actually do with the fleet. He wanted to take them back to California. He wanted to take them back home, where he had, preferably San Diego, where he has all the facilities needed to support them. In January 1941, Richardson is relieved of command early by Admiral Kimmel. His complaining about the position of the fleet undermined his role in the eyes of Roosevelt. Basically, he kept suggesting to Roosevelt that his fleet being there was a logistical, operational, and strategic nightmare. Or, in other words, opinion, the presence of the fleet in Hawaii might influence a civilian political government, but that Japan had a military government which knew that the fleet was undermanned, unprepared for war, and had no training auxiliary ships without which it could not undertake an active operations. I further stated that we were more likely to make the Japanese feel that we meant business if a train were assembled and the fleet returned to the Pacific coast. The complements filled, the ships docked and fully supplied with ammunition, provisions, stores, and fuel, and then stripped for war operations. The more you look into the events of 1941 and the various American and British preparations, the more you realize how hollow they were. How They were something that looked good on paper, but were not really something which was going to impress or intimidate anyone who actually had an intelligence network. This doesn't mean that it should have been taken as a come on or we're weak, do what you like. It's a statement of intent. But the trouble is, the democracies are playing deterrence by their rules. And Japan isn't playing deterrence by their rules anymore. And you can see this in the secrecy around the Yamato class. Because if you're playing deterrence, the Yamato class are really, really quite good. The Yamatos are really quite good for deterrence. Why? Because they're massive, and if you take a photograph of them, they look colossal. Now, there are probably going to be lots of people commenting down below going, yes, but a Iowa-class battleship can match them in Iowa-class can match them in a fight, and this and that. And, oh, yes, the Americans can build all these. You can. That's all true. And probably some will also quote, yes, but the King George V, if they get close enough, can do this. Yeah, you're probably true. But the reality is politics. And most news is an image game. Even in the 1930s, I know, you don't want to hear that, but it is. It's an image game. Why do the Germans have a habit of making troops, even to this day, doesn't matter which generation you're talking about, march at night holding torches? Well, because it's a good way of making it look very impressive and potent and hiding the fact that they all look like they're slightly tubby and overweight, and i.e. like me after 2 years of COVID. It works because people just see the sea of torches and marching, and they maybe get a sort of image of the front rank, who are your ones who actually look like they've visited the gym and kept a diet going. Maybe they see a bit of the second rank, who are the ones who look presentable, but they don't really see in the darkness the others. It's the same with this. That, you deploy Yamato, it looks massive. The first question the politicians are going to be, what do we have that matches it? And you could sit there and go, well, we will use aircraft to attack and slow it down with torpedoes, and then we would engage with our battleships. They'll switch off. You're giving them a complicated answer. What they want to hear is, you have something which matches it in terms of public image. Really interesting idea. And one I've often considered with Pearl Harbor is Yamato is commissioned on the 16th December 1941. 9 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She's launched in August 1940. If in May 1940, when it was announced that the ships were staying in Pearl Harbor for 2 more weeks, the Japanese had released pictures of their brand new super battleship and how powerful it was, and maybe suggested that a couple of sisters were closer to completion than they actually were. Roosevelt could well have found himself in trouble, because to the politicians in Congress and in the press, it would have looked like he was hazarding all these American battleships within striking range of the Japanese super battleships. And their own weren't anywhere near completion. He might well have been forced to withdraw the fleet to San Diego and step back until the Montanas entered service, or at least the Hours, until their own super battleships were ready. Not because of their actual military capabilities, but because of their political capabilities. But that doesn't happen. Roosevelt has gambled on Pearl Harbor intimidating the Japanese. He can't deploy a fleet to the Philippines. That would be suicide. The Americans, everyone realizes that the fleet in the Philippines is going to be sunk. In fact, that's what they're betting on. They don't think the Japanese are going to reach Pearl Harbor. They think the Japanese are going to attack whatever forces they have in the Philippines. They might well be putting air forces and all those things there, but they are pretty much that there are quite a few people who are reckoning those are what are going to be hit and taken out first. They think they have enough depth that Pearl Harbor is secure. So, Pearl Harbor, how does it potentially fit into the doctrine? Well, it could be a decisive battle. We'll get into that. So it could be Kantai Kessen. It could be attrition and bait before the decisive battle, in which case it's Yugeki Zengen Sakusen or Yogeki Sakusen, i.e. the surprise one. Buying the time to prepare for decisive battle. This is an interesting concept. Now, I actually have a reason why I don't think it's the latter. And I do think it's the latter. I think short term it might be considered to be that. That might be hoped for. Buy them some 6 to 8 months to prepare things, and I'll get into that discussion. But I don't think it was a long-term idea for it to do so. The reason I don't think it's a long-term idea for it to do so is if it is a long-term idea, and I have no doubt that Japanese planning for Pearl Harbor was going on almost as soon as and I'll be getting into some of the actual dates, reported dates, almost as soon as the US Navy moved into Pearl Harbor. Because I think if they had been that, then focusing their industry on trying to surge ships out for that period would have been sensible. Because the more ships you have in the water in that period, the more likely you are to achieve your defensive goals. And then the stronger fleet you're likely to have for the further phases of Yugeki Zengen Sakusen. Subject to attack. Well, traditionally as argued, it's destroyed important fleet units that prevent the Pacific Fleet from interfering with conquests of Dutch East Indies, Philippines, and Malaya. Please note, there are quite a few books which seem to suggest it's just Dutch East Indies and the Malaya, but I'm fairly sure from my reading of the Japanese sources and of some other books which actually seem to focus far more on the Japanese sources that the Philippines is part of it. Buy time to consolidate position and control of their area before the massive Vincent Walsh Act production starts streaming out. Now, one of the examples of this is that the Americans have ordered 80-odd destroyers. That's a surge. Impede mobilization of the American forces in the Pacific. Unfortunately, even the Japanese know that the major base for the Pacific is San Diego. Hawaii is a nice forward base, but it's not even really Singapore at this point. It's getting there, but it's nowhere near there at this point. Undermine American morale and force the US to seek peace. See, that is when I think people try and think that it is the Kantai Kessen, because the Kantai Kessen has that as part of its doctrine. Big decisive battle undermines morale. But I don't see that with Pearl Harbor. I really don't. Traditional advantage of attack. Any ship sunk would be done so in shallow water, making them recoverable. Again, this is all very much from the American perspective. Let's consider what some of the Japanese sources say. there is a 1936 staff recommendations. If the enemy's principal ships, especially aircraft carriers, are at anchor at Pearl Harbor before the war, it is important to aim at opening hostilities by taking the enemy as unawares with an air raid, carrier-borne aircraft, and large and medium flying boats. 1936. I know. There is this idea that some people, some histories have put out that basically Taranto happens and suddenly the Japanese have an idea. No. Sorry. No. Just no. Yamamoto's original plan, which seems to be being discussed at some point in 1938, possibly 1938, possibly moving into 1939, 1940. Torpedo bombers on a one-way mission launched 500 miles from Pearl Harbor, destroyers waiting around to pick up crews. They would target only enemy battleships. Fits with the capital ship doctrine. Does it? Remember, Yamato is, and I've spelt that like the battleship, Yamato, sorry. I got it right in the early part of the slides. Anyway. Yamato's original plan is being written at a time when aircraft are still advancing, when the capabilities of aircraft are still not quite sure, even for someone who's as big an advocate as he is. In which case, the battleship is still the decisive weapon, and the US Navy has a decisive superiority on them. They're thinking that attrition, and the night attack especially, will account for a large proportion of any destroyer and possibly cruiser numbers, superiority numbers of the US Navy. But I'm guessing they're planning on attriting the battleships early, because you cut down them, you've given yourself a real chance. This is sent to his carrier chief in many respects. His chief advisor on naval aviation at this point. And that gentleman passes on to Canada. One of the more well-known of the Japanese naval aviators. He adapts it to a different plan. The main objectives of the attack should be the American carriers and land-based planes. The blow had to be strong enough to eliminate the American fleet as a threat for at least 6 months, the time considered necessary to occupy the Dutch East Indies. All of Japan's carrier strength should be used, without exception. Torpedo bombers would deliver the main attack, but because it was not known whether the torpedoes could be successfully launched in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor, shorter-range dive bombers also had to be employed. The range of Japanese carriers was not enough to permit a trip to Pearl Harbor and back, therefore Japan had to study and perfect at-sea replenishments in the harsh conditions expected in the North Pacific. The operation had to be a complete surprise. So we have an American-centric idea of what the reasons and objectives for the attack are, and we have some Japanese sources, and they do agree at certain points. But the one which comes closest to an idea potentially of a decisive battle doctrine is Canada's. Potentially. Everything else seems rather more limited and focused. But even his is focused on the carriers. Take out the carriers and we'll win. He's an advocate for naval aviation. And honestly, you can see that because the idea is you'll destroy the battleships as they maneuver at sea. Again, if you look at what has happened in the Mediterranean and various other fights at this point, when he's writing this, that makes perfect sense. Take out the carriers while you can. The battleships will come to you, because that's how they have to fight. So let's see, as planned, how does it fit in relationship to the Kantai Kessen criteria? Well, is it against a significant portion of the enemy fleet? Yes. It's basically the U.S. Navy. There are 8 battleships, 8 cruisers, 30 destroyers, 4 submarines, 3 cutters and of the U.S. Coast Guard, and 47 other ships. So, yeah, that's a pretty significant portion of the U.S. Navy. Not the whole U.S. Navy, but a significant portion of them. What is the Japanese force, though? 6 carriers. Akagi, Kaga, Soryo, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Sukaku. 2 battle cruisers, Hei and Krishna. 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma. 1 light cruiser, Abakuma. 10 destroyers, 8 tankers, and between 3 and 20 submarines, depending upon how you assess them. And their involvement. And I know, Wikipedia listed as 23 fleet submarines and 5 midget submarines. There is 1 submarine which I'm not getting into. Let's put it this way, it's a debate between me and another author, and their book has actually been published, and they're cited in the Wikipedia page, so it's a debate which I will get into. Now, again, the total aircraft carried. There is again a debate. I have a figure which I've put there of roughly 318 aircraft, which I make their operational available aircraft, and their planning as for it is. Again, there are others who give higher figures. It depends on what you're counting as aircraft, whether you're counting every aircraft carried on the ship or whether you're counting those which are operational. But it doesn't really matter. That's me getting into the details, and as I said, this is not the purpose of this video. Is it a majority portion or even the whole of the Japanese fleet operations? No. It's a significant portion. It's the majority, you can say, of the carrier strength. Although, interestingly and critically, I would argue, it doesn't include the 3rd carrier division, as they had been. The light carriers, Zuho and Hoshiko. Now, yes, they can't carry that many aircraft, and we can talk about their ranges and various other things. But if you're going for an all-out Kantai Kessen attack on the US Navy, especially if you're doing it by air power, even if it would have taken an extra couple of tankers to reach it, which might have slowed down some of your operations elsewhere, surely if this is the principal purpose of your attack, you should do it. Let's consider the targets of the waves. First wave. Well, their target is supposed to target first group of the first wave are supposed to target battleships and aircraft carriers. The second group are supposed to target Ford Island and Wheeler Field. I would argue that is about enemy defense suppression, so that's to enable the second wave and any follow-up waves. Third group, target aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barber's Point, and Canoche. Again, this is about suppression of enemy air defenses. This is about enabling subsequent waves. This is about attriting your enemy forces so they cannot withstand any further waves you attack with. So despite this, the second wave does actually take far more casualties than the first wave, because by that point the air defenses have actually got themselves working. The second wave is divided into the first group, which attack the aircraft and hangars at Canoe, Ford Island, and Barber's Point, and the hangars and aircraft on Hickam Field. The second group, they're supposed to target aircraft carriers and cruisers. Hence, they're carrying general-purpose bombs, because, let's be honest, whilst armor-piercing is necessary for the battleships, general-purpose bombs will probably do enough damage on a cruiser and definitely do enough damage on a carrier with a wooden flight deck. Third group, aircraft at Ford Island, Hickam Field, Wheeler Field, Barber's Point, and Canoe. Again, it's suppression of enemy air defenses to allow the other strikes to get through. There's also this other point. You are attacking the enemy, and we've already discussed this. You're attacking the enemy in a place where they're going to be able to recover these ships. You're attacking the enemy in a place where you're not, where they have theoretically got supplies. Not many, as we've already been over, but they have got supplies. And they can get supplies too. And you can't really interdict those supplies because it's so far away and you haven't got enough submarines. It's not. And it is a long, long way away. I would argue, if we were talking about an operation which had taken a lot more ships with it, if the Japanese had really sunk everything into having putting the fuel in place while they could, and having the ships to transport it, and replenishing at sea, and taking a far bigger force, even the extra carriers, but also the extra Hongus, the extra battle cruisers with them, and cruisers. A significant enough force that they felt they could stay for longer and launch a third, or maybe a fourth wave to attack the enemy as they're in harbour, as they're bottled up. That would be more in the nature of a Kantai Kessen. That would be more about that. But it's a long way to go. It's a long way to go if you're not seeking a decisive battle. Because there's Japan. As we went over earlier in the defensive doctrine of their forces, carriers were critical to their defenses, setting up the defensive perimeter. They are critical to attriting enemy forces as they try and penetrate your perimeter. You're risking a critical component of your strategy that's been recognized as critical for that strategy on an operation which isn't supposed to be a decisive battle. As executed, how does it fit? Well, there's a problem. as executed. The pilots do focus in on battleships, but there are no carriers there for them to focus on, so of course they're going to be next down the priority list. Why? Why aren't the facilities of Pearl Harbor higher up the priority list? Let's be honest. If you took out the floating docks as well as some of the battleships, you could have achieved a lot. And as it is, they sink 4 battleships, an ex-battleship, a harbour tug. They damage 4 more battleships. They damage 3 cruisers. They damage 3 destroyers, 3 other ships. They take out 188 aircraft for 29 lost on their own. They damage 159 aircraft for 74 damaged on their side. They kill 2,335 American service personnel, most of them, and wound 1,143 for loss of 64 and 1 captured. That sounds fairly decisive. There were 8 battleships and 8 cruisers there. There are now 5 operational cruisers. There were 30 destroyers there. There are now 27 operational destroyers. The Japanese have lost 5 midget subs. So does that make it a decisive battle? The kill rates, the losses on both sides? No. It's decisive in that it shapes the war for the next 6 months. It does. It affects what the Americans have operational. But let's be honest, even if they had more ships operational, even if Pearl Harbor hadn't happened, they still had the limitations of their tanker fleet, and the tanker fleet as it existed in 1941 and the beginning of 1942. They were building more, but they didn't have them. And honestly, there is a converse thing where actually if the US Navy had had more ships available, it would have been tempted to use them, or at least have faced demands to use them, especially for the defense of the Philippines and other places. And that could have put more stresses on the logistics train as it was building up and developing, which could have meant they might not have been able to do other operations. The Doolittle raid might not have been possible because they just might not have had the tankers and the fuel available. Instead, the comparison of the Royal Navy's attack on Taranto, because this is where they often compared. There's actually something rather interesting when I did do a comparison, because if you look at the Mediterranean fleet and what turns up at Taranto, you get the Royal Navy turning up with everything they have available is not far away from Taranto. So if the Italian Navy had surged out, they would have certainly been able to engage it. And I would argue that if the Kantai Kessen Doctrine was applied to Pearl Harbor, certainly one of the things I would have expected to see would be a larger fleet there. Because I would expect the idea that the US Navy might surge out to try and chase down the carriers and the task group would be possible. Well, whatever remained might surge out in a fit of fury and try and hunt them down. It shouldn't. But whilst you can't plan on your opponent being stupid or making decisions out of fury and anger, you never know your luck. So, what was the basic Japanese plan for war? And does this affect on whether or not we think that Pearl Harbor is a product of the Kantai Kessen or a product of another doctrine? Well, Phase 1, seizure of southern areas. The attack on the United States fleet in Hawaii. Thank you, Roosevelt. You've put it in Hawaii, so you've put it in strike range. And the seizure of strategic areas and foundation positions for the establishment of a perimeter for the defense of the southern resource area and the Japanese mainland. The area to be seized was that within the line which joined the Kuhnels, Marshalls, including Wake, Bismarcks, Timor, Java, Sumatra, Malaya, and Burma. Well, that's all well and nice and good. There's a small problem, though. If you're going to seize a resource area, you have to be able to exploit it. And you're either assuming you're going to seize all the infrastructure that allows you to exploit it intact, or you've got to be prepared and build in time to actually do the exploitation. Could be a problem with the Japanese doctrine and planning at that point. Phase 2, consolidation and strengthening of the defensive perimeter. Phase 3, the interception and destruction of any attacking strength which might threaten the defensive perimeter of the vital areas within the perimeter. Concurrently with intercept operations, the activation of plans to destroy the United States' will to fight. In war, you're often faced with making the least worst decision. I would argue if you're concentrating on your opponent's will to fight rather than ability to fight, you've already admitted you can't fight there. You can't deal with their ability to fight, so therefore you should probably avoid fighting them in the first place. It also explains to me perhaps as well why Pearl Harbor is most certainly not a decisive battle doctrine attack. Why it is a replacement for the attack on the Asiatic fleet on the the fleet that was supposed to be in the Philippines, because, or a continuation of that theory, because they were now, by being at Pearl Harbor, were now in range. I think it is about buying time. I think it is about buying time for consolidation, and I think they think the decisive battle will take place further in. But I think there's a problem, and I think it's the same reason I brought up Taranto, but I didn't go into it fully when discussing those slides, because I wanted to bring it up here. Taranto is an operation I have described which is both at the same time too successful and not successful enough. It's too successful in that it damages the Italian fleet to such an extent they don't come charging out, and they don't come in, therefore, into the waiting, warm embrace of the massed Queen Elizabeth-class battleships that Cunningham has brought with him, and has there just for that reason. He's hoping the Italians come charging out as a fleet to try and hunt down the Royal Navy in the Eastern Mediterranean. He's hoping they do that. They don't. He hangs around for a whole day, pretty much hoping they'll do it, and then withdraws. Pretty much hangs around, he doesn't go back as fast as he could do for that reason. In many ways, therefore, you could say he was seeking a decisive battle. He was seeking to damage the Italians, hope they come out, they charge out with their forces reduced enough so that he had equality or perhaps even superiority in the aggregate of strength versus them in battleships, and could engage and fight the good fight and win from the Cunningham's perspective. That's not the strategy at Pearl Harbor. The strategy at Pearl Harbor is delaying. But the trouble is, if you sink too many battleships, if you damage too many battleships, then the US Navy doesn't have them, so they have to take a pause of operations. They have to think something else. They have to think through and go, hang on, we need to approach this in a different way. It takes time for them to think things through and to react and adapt. But you want them to come charging into you. When they're weakened, you want them to come to you. You want them weak enough that you're able to fight them in a more even way, but not so weak they don't come to you in the first place. You want them strong enough they still think they can win, and so they come to attack you. Because if the US Navy goes with a war of attrition and slowly tightens the noose, you have no chance. Japan can only destroy the will of the United States to fight in any way, shape, or form if they can actually have a decisive battle. You can't have a decisive battle in a bay where the ships, even if they sink, are able to be salvaged. You can't have a decisive battle when you're engaging mostly the older, less good part of the enemy fleet, while they're constructing even more. You have to get them in the mindset where they think, we've lost a few ships, you've attacked us, we're going to charge in and fight a battle with you, but because you haven't done that much damage, and we've surged out our new ships, so they're in the fleet, even though they're not really ready. Because, let's be honest, if we consider what had already happened with the deployment of the fleet forward to Pearl Harbor in the first place, you can understand the Japanese thinking that the Americans might fall for that the American political leadership might fall for that as an option, and might actually send the fleet out. After all, they'd failed to listen to the advice of Richardson, and he was one of their best admirals. So why do they think they'd listen to Kimmel or any other admiral saying no? But it achieves too much. Very nearly. And I would argue probably if they had launched that third wave, because of the natural inclination of the pilots and what they like to attack, could well have been a decisive battle. Just not decisive enough by any stretch of imagination. Being decisive in it would have probably stopped the Americans having battleships, or at least those 8 battleships, any of them in service during World War II, which would have forced them to probably surge cruiser construction even more and probably try and surge the Iowas even more. That's the reality of what we're talking about. Even if the Japanese win, they don't really win at Pearl Harbor, because you can't. So, if I had to pick, which doctrine this all comes from, I would say it's this one. The attrition and bait before decisive battle. It's Yugeki Zengen Sakusen, or Yogeki Sakusen. That's where it comes from. That's where Pearl Harbor doctrinally fits and operationally fits as both carried out and both planned. Because here is the thing that actually provides a far stronger reason for not launching that third wave. Because if you launch the third wave and you think you've already done quite well with the first 2 waves, then the third wave might definitely stop the Americans coming charging towards you. And I can just imagine the thought process going through Nagumo's head, thinking, have I done too much? Because the only chance the Japanese have is if they do have an early decisive battle in their side of the Pacific. is if the Americans charge stupidly, headlongly, obsessively to the Philippines with as much force as they could to get there before the Philippines falls. And the problem is, if you take out the forces so they feel they can't do that, they're not going to. And by the time they get round to coming forward, their construction is going to start to take its toll already. Even before you actually start fighting, you're already losing the war of attrition because of their construction. Unless you can get that early big victory. So, the Yamato class. Kantai Kessen. Decisive battleships? Nah. Sorry. They're not. Yes, they're powerful. Yes, they are wonderful ships. And yes, if the Japanese had built even more bigger ones, they still wouldn't have been. Because if you are preparing to fight a decisive battle, that is going to involve probably a fight at night. And probably dealing with whatever numbers you have to deal with the next day. You want numbers of ships. Building 18-inch ships, they are great in status symbols. They are supposed to be able to take on 3 standards. That is the sort of 2 standards, possibly 3, but 2 standards. Be able to kill one with the forward turrets while the aft turret holds one off. That is the sort of thing which is a deterrent argument. You put this out, you basically invalidate all the existing US Navy battleships and go, you can't, and suddenly the politicians don't want to risk sending them in a battle, because if they do and they get sunk, you did that knowingly. You sent them to war against those 2. They are deterrent assets. The facts produced by them are deterrent assets. They are big gun, big ships. They are deterrent assets. Taikan, Kyogo, Shugi. In the Kantai Kessen, decisive battle, or in the war of the attrition till the decisive battle, they're not really that useful, because honestly, what are you most likely to kill during the war of attrition if you kill any battleships? It's probably going to be the less capable, less well armed, not upgraded standards. If anything's going to die early, it's going to be them. So they're not going to be your problems. Churning out more battleships so that you can match whatever's remaining at least 1-to-1, or as close to 1-to-1 as possible, is far more sensible than this, because it takes so much of your industry from a military point of view. But if you're trying to deter conflict, if you really do believe your own hype about democracies being weak and the politics of them being petty and sullied, and honestly, considering how democracies do work, and considering how Britain had reacted to Germany's build-up, etc., there is a deterrent logic behind this class. Trouble is, it's not used, because the Japanese obsession with secrecy, I would argue. They wanted it to be their ace in the sleeve as they saw war coming, and it could never be that. When you consider the admirals who supported it, they supported it based on it being a deterrent force, and it can never be that if it was kept secret. You publicize it. You make it loud. You make it proud. Then it becomes a bar that everyone else has to reach to. Everyone else has to get there. You make it. You publicize this. You force the British to probably build the Lions. You force the Americans to build the Montanas. And they're all thinking, we can't fight them till we have those in service. So you basically get a free run for at least a few months, probably in China. Despite, yes, America will probably try the economic sanctions, etc., and those things, but there's also going to be a moving back of their forces, a weakening of their position. And if they do have to withdraw from Pearl Harbor, then probably people like the Dutch East Indies, etc., at least start looking the other way while you're selling your stuff. Maybe even the British decide to sell you the stuff just to stop you fighting it. So, lives. The vote isn't in yet when I'm recording this, so I can't announce them. But I can tell you the 14th of December is going to be the Royal Navy Monitors Robert class. I hope you're looking forward to it. And the Patreon vote topics are still live as I speak, as I'm recording this, but I'm not going to go into too much because I think by the time this goes up, they definitely won't be live. Anyway. Thank you very much. The vote will be decided, and I'll be recording the next long patrol for this week because there's going to be a second long patrol, and that will announce their vote winners. And, well, thank you everyone for supporting the channel. Thank you for everyone who likes the channel. Please, if you get to the end, I keep asking different things, but this is because I'm having an interesting discussion with YouTube, which keeps going, no one watches to the end of the videos. And I go, well, they do. And I have proof, because I have these comments, because I say these things at the end of the video. And I've asked for claps, and I've asked for people to put the times. So, can you put a little steam train in if you reach the end of the video into a comment? Can you put a comment with a steam train in there? Thank you. Thank you very much. Take care, and I hope you enjoyed and found this video interesting.